They didn't just steal the fruits of my life's labor. They tried to destroy my very existence. My scream was like a sharp blade in the sterile silence of the server room as I watched federal agents storm the penthouse apartment I'd inadvertently paid for. Enjoy the spectacle, Kaylin, because it's the last thing you'll possess before the ice melts. I laughed, a nearly insane laugh, feeling the blade of justice descend upon Lavinia's greed. But as the adrenaline surged to blinding levels, the world suddenly blurred, pulling me back to the cold, deceptive stillness of where this nightmare truly began. The autumn wind in Greenwich has a way of sounding like a warning. As I stood by the mahogany bay window of my parents' estate, watching the dry oak leaves spiral toward the manicured lawn, I felt a familiar heaviness in my chest. While this house, with its towering white pillars and history of quiet expectations, had always felt more like a museum than a home. I watched my reflection in the glass. Angela, the daughter who succeeded by accident in a world that only valued lineage. I had spent years building the Aegis protocol, pouring my soul into lines of code that promised security for millions. Yet, in this room, my achievements were merely invisible static against the backdrop of family tradition. Have you ever felt like a ghost in a house you helped pay for? It's a silent, suffocating kind of grief. The scent of Chanel No. 5 drifted into the room before she did. My mother, Lavinia, entered with a practiced elegance that usually signaled a hidden agenda. She was organizing what she called a farewell dinner for my upcoming trip to Tokyo. But the seating chart told a different story. The center of the table was reserved for my brother, Kaylin. He sat there now, swirling a glass of $500 scotch, a bottle I had purchased for my father's birthday, and looking at me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Still playing with your little computer codes, Angela?" he asked, his voice dripping with the effortless condescension of a man who had never had to work for a roof over his head. "Mom says you're going to Japan to talk to some businessmen. Don't bore them too much with the technical jargon." I didn't snap back. I've learned that true strength isn't found in what we consume or the noise we make, but in what we create for others. I simply offered him a thin, graceful smile. "Innovation is a quiet business, Kaylin," I replied softly. But it's the only thing that keeps the lights on." My mother clapped her hands together, dismissively ending the tension. She looked at me with a maternal warmth that felt as thin as parchment. To them, I was the lucky one, the smallest voice that happened to find a golden microphone. They didn't see the 80-hour weeks or the sacrifices. They only saw a resource to be managed. Dinner was a chore of clinking silverware and hollow praise for Kaylin's latest failed venture. As the coffee was served, Lavinia reached into her silk pocket and produced a small velvet box. Inside was my grandmother's locket, a piece I had loved since I was a child. "I want you to have this for your trip, Angela," she whispered, her hand trembling slightly in a display of calculated vulnerability. "Family is the only sanctuary we have in this cold world. It's a cage only if we don't trust the people inside." She then slipped a small stack of papers onto the table, tucked neatly beside the dessert spoon. "Just some routine family trust updates, darling. Since you're the vice president now, we need your signature to keep the education fund for the nieces and nephews active while you're away." I felt a prickle of instinctive alarm, but the weight of the locket in my palm and the yearning for my mother's approval clouded my judgment. I wanted to believe that this, finally, was a moment of genuine connection. I didn't see the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation hidden in the middle of those routine power of attorney documents. I didn't know that under the quiet laws of this state, my signature was declaring me incapacitated due to a severe delusional depression I didn't have. I took the pen, and I thought about the sanctuary of home. I signed my name, unaware that I was effectively handing over the keys to my own life. Sometimes the hands that feed us are the same ones that build the walls. The black car arrived at 4 a.m. to take me to JFK. My father, Ossian, stood on the porch, offering a stiff nod that felt like a sentence. He didn't meet my eyes. His complicit silence felt heavier than my mother's active deception. As we pulled away, I looked back at the sprawling estate, the house I had maintained through every financial storm. I was leaving as a leader in a global firm, yet I was still just the little girl whose labor was considered communal property. I hugged my mother at the door, whispering a prayer for our bond, truly believing that this trip was a bridge to a better future. The ascent over the Atlantic was smooth, and the cabin of the plane, a quiet cocoon of false security. I opened my laptop, intending to review my notes for the Tokyo summit. For a moment, I felt a sense of peace, the quiet power of a woman who had finally earned her place at the table. Then the screen flickered. A high-priority notification from Caspian appeared, the text jagged and urgent. It was sent through our private, encrypted channel. My breath caught in my throat as the first word loaded. Emergency. Before I could click it, the cabin Wi-Fi signal vanished, the connection icon turning a hollow, dead gray. I was suspended 30,000 feet above the ocean, trapped in a silent metal tube, while a life I had worked 20 years to build was being sold behind my back. The rain in Tokyo didn't wash away the sin. It only made the blade of betrayal glisten sharper against the neon sky. Emerging from the pressurized cabin of the aircraft felt like stepping into a different dimension, one where the oxygen was thinner and the humidity hung like a damp shroud over my skin. I stood in the heart of the Tokyo Tech Summit, a sprawling glass and steel cathedral of innovation that vibrated with the hum of 1,000 servers. High-speed data streams cascaded down massive LED pillars, and for a moment, the professional pride I had cultivated over 20 years pulsed through my veins. The Aegis algorithm was no longer just lines of code in a dark room. It was the culmination of every sleepless night, every sacrifice I had made to prove that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. My grandfather always said we do not control the winds, only how we set the sails. Today, I felt ready to conquer the world for the sake of the legacy he left me. I gazed at my reflection in the gleaming chrome glass. The woman who had survived the subtle suffocation of Greenwich looked back at me with a steady, sharp gaze. Deep in my travel bag, the velvet box containing my mother's pendant lay silently in the shadows. It was a small, heavy object, a reminder of home, something that had kept me grounded throughout the 13-hour flight. I reached in, letting my fingertips lightly trace the cold metal, a tangible reminder of the family ties I believed I was protecting. The conference hall was magnificent, a sea of suitors and glittering screens representing the pinnacle of global finance and security. I was the chief architect, and the woman holding the key to the next generation of digital security. That excessive confidence only made the impending collapse seem more apparent than ever. The first crack in the foundation appeared as I retreated to my hotel in the Shinjuku district to retrieve my physical backup drive for the final demo. The elevator ride was a blur of chrome and silence. When I stepped into my room, the air felt wrong. It was too sterile, too vacant. The mahogany desk where my primary laptop had been charging was bare. My encrypted phone, which had been resting on the nightstand, was gone. Even the safe was ajar, its contents vanished. My U.S. passport, the document that tied me to my identity and my home, had been plucked from its hidden slot. The room hadn't been tossed. It had been surgically cleaned. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken locks. The intruder hadn't forced their way in. They had used a digital master key. A cold, rhythmic panic began to drum against my ribs, and I turned and ran back to the hallway, my heels clicking frantically against the plush carpet. Near the service elevator, I nearly collided with an elderly hotel staffer who had tripped, his cart of linens spilling across the floor. Despite the roar of blood in my ears and the violations screaming through my mind, I knelt beside him. My hands shook as I helped him gather the white sheets. "Kindness is the one thing no one can steal from you," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He bowed deeply, his eyes full of a gentle concern that I couldn't afford to mirror. I stood up, left him there, and raced toward the lobby. I was legally and digitally being erased in a foreign country, a ghost drifting through a sea of neon lights. I secured a rental tablet at the business center, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. My fingers flew across the glass, attempting to bypass the secondary security protocols I had built for Aegis. Every attempt was met with a brutal white-on-red message. Access denied. Ownership transferred. The internal server logs showed a series of high-level administrative overrides executed only 3 hours prior. The digital signature used to authorize the transfer was mine. Or rather, it was the biometric equivalent of the signature I had scrawled on those trust documents in the Greenwich dining room. I sat in the sterile glow of the screen, the silence of the room becoming a vacuum. The realization didn't come as a sudden shout. It arrived as a slow, freezing tide. The terminal showed the transaction history in a cold, clinical font. Aegis had been sold to Raven Corp, a predatory conglomerate known for dismantling intellectual property for scrap. The price was a mere $15 million, a fraction of its true worth, but exactly the amount needed to secure a luxury penthouse in Manhattan. My mother hadn't just sold a piece of software. She had used the psychiatric hoax, the very documents I signed in a moment of misplaced trust, to declare me legally incompetent. Under the cold efficiency of the U.S. Commercial Code, the sale appeared perfectly legitimate on the surface. Because I had signed the incapacity clause, I was now the victim of a lawful theft. My own quality of mercy had been used to sharpen the knife that was currently carved into my back. I stepped out of the hotel into the incessant Shinjuku rain. The sky was a ghastly purple, and neon signs reflecting on the wet pavement in distorted streaks of electric blue and green. I stood there, lost, penniless, and stripped of my name. Towering above the street, a giant digital billboard displayed a revolving loop of success stories and luxury brands. In the dark glass of a closed shop, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. I looked smaller than I had an hour ago, but the resentment, the simmering bitterness, was beginning to crystallize into something harder than grief. My mother had taken my job, but in doing so, she had destroyed the only version of me she could control. The rain soaked through my blazer. The cold seeped into my bones, yet my mind was moving with a surgical, terrifying clarity. Every word Lavinia had spoken at dinner, every tear she had shed while handing me the locket, it was a calculated move in a game I hadn't realized we were playing. The dinner wasn't a farewell. It was an execution. She had gambled on my love for the family to blind me to her greed. She had assumed that the smallest voice would stay quiet, buried under the weight of a fraudulent medical record. I reached up and unclasped the locket from my neck, the gold chain snapping under the pressure. I looked at the shimmering jewelry in my hand, then let it slip through my fingers, watching it disappear into the dark, rushing water of the gutter. Standing in the center of the world's most crowded intersection, surrounded by thousands of strangers, I had never been more alone. But the fear was being replaced by a singular, cold objective. They had erased Angela, the obedient daughter, but they had left behind the architect. They had sold the software, but they didn't realize I was the only one who knew where the back doors were hidden. I looked up at the digital billboard, the light washing over my face. "You didn't just take my work, Mother," I whispered into the wind. "You took the girl who loved you. Now, you're left with the woman who knows you." The thunder rumbled across the Tokyo sky, a low, ominous sound reflecting a shift in my soul. The rhythm, the beating of my heart, had changed. It was no longer the frantic pounding of panic. It was the steady, rhythmic beat of a machine starting up. I turned my back on the neon lights and began walking toward the only person left who could help me pull the thread to unravel their entire carpet. The air in the Shinjuku back alley was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, and the mechanical hum of old servers. And I sat in a cramped booth, my rain-soaked blazer clinging to my skin, staring at a cursor that blinked with agonizing indifference. I had used my last few yen to secure 30 minutes of connectivity, a digital lifeline in a city where I was now a non-entity. Without my biometric devices or my primary phone, I was a ghost trying to haunt my own life. I bypassed the standard security filters, my fingers dancing across the greasy keys with a precision born of pure desperation. It was a high-pressure gamble. One wrong move and the system would flag me as an intruder, locking me out of the very world I had built. Then a miracle appeared in the form of a familiar, jagged piece of code. Caspian had found me. Using a secret backdoor server we'd built since the early days of Project Aegis, he'd bypassed the digital data erasure the hotel had carried out. His voice, crackling through the cheap headphones, was a glimmer of hope amidst the rising chaos. "Angela, listen to me," he whispered, his tone panicked but focused. "They didn't just sell the software. Lavinia and Kaylin used the forged incapacity certificate. They liquidated your domestic assets. They filed a lawsuit, claiming you were a danger to yourself." I felt the ground vanish beneath me. The legal disaster was total. Under U.S. law, that certification allowed them to act as my guardians, making the sale of my intellectual property technically legal in the eyes of Raven Corp. But Caspian had one more secret. I moved the source code to the cold storage vault before they locked the primary server. "They sold a shell, Angela. But you have to get back before they finalize the mental health warrant. Wealth is what you have, but character is who you are when you have nothing." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced my voice to remain steady. For Caspian's sake, I had to be the leader he believed in, even while sitting in a dark alleyway ruins. The screen suddenly flickered, hijacked by an incoming video call that I couldn't block. The face of my brother, Kaylin, filled the monitor. He was lounging in a sun-drenched Manhattan penthouse, a glass of expensive champagne catching the light. The contrast to my dismal surroundings was a jarring physical blow. He laughed, a high, thin sound that mocked my disheveled state. "Look at you, Angela," he sneered, leaning closer to the camera. "From the queen of tech to a homeless girl in a Tokyo basement. It's almost poetic." He stood up, panning the camera to show a pile of trash bags by a massive marble fireplace. My heart stopped. Those were my childhood journals, my original research notes from the garage with Grandpa, and my personal mementos. He picked up a leather-bound diary and tossed it into the flames. "Mom said we needed to clear out the clutter," he said, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying entitlement. "Thanks for the pool, sis. It's the first time in your life you've actually been useful to this family." I didn't scream. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing even a single tear. I silently observed with a horrified expression, my mind registering every detail of his past. I saw the specific labels on the wine barrels and the luxury furniture, all evidence that Aegis money was being laundered through this real estate deal. That silence was my first real victory. I let him talk, let him gloat, until he grew weary of my silence and hung up. He thought he had cornered me, but he only offered me a path to his own destruction. I sat in the silence that followed, my hands trembling as the adrenaline began to ebb. As an elderly Japanese woman, the cafe attendant who had been watching me from the counter, walked over quietly. She didn't ask questions. She simply placed a cup of hot green tea and a clean, warm towel on the desk. When I reached for my pocket, she shook her head, offering a small, knowing smile that transcended the language barrier. A stranger gave me warmth when my own mother gave me a blizzard. It was a profound, humanizing moment that grounded my soul. To forgive is not to excuse, but to refuse to let their hate live in your heart. I wiped my face, feeling the warmth return to my fingers. I turned back to the terminal, my resolve hardening into a diamond-sharp edge. I typed a series of commands for Caspian, my movements rhythmic and certain. "Prepare the logic bomb," I instructed. If they try to relicense the Aegis code to Ravencorp, the security flaws will trigger. We won't just prove the theft. We'll make the product radioactive. I knew the legal hurdles ahead were immense, especially with a mental health warrant hanging over my head like a guillotine. But I was no longer fighting for a seat at their table. I was fighting for the right to exist on my own terms. As I prepared to log off and head to the US Embassy, the cafe's printer suddenly groaned to life. A single sheet of paper slid out, the text encrypted but automatically decoded by Caspian's lingering link. It was a formal legal notice from New York. Lavinia hadn't just stolen my work. She had filed for an emergency involuntary commitment order. If I stepped foot on New York soil without a plan, I wouldn't be going home. And I would be going to a locked ward, effectively silenced forever while they spent the rest of my life's work. I stared at the paper, the ink still warm, knowing that the journey home would be the most dangerous thing I had ever done. The hum of the Boeing 777's engines was a low, meditative vibration that seemed to synchronize with the pulsing tension in my temples. I sat in the first-class cabin, the dim blue ambient lighting casting long spectral shadows across the leather seat. Outside the window, a sliver of the moon hung over a vast, indifferent ocean of clouds. It was a beautiful view, the kind I used to share with my grandfather, but tonight it felt like a cold reminder of how far I had fallen. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my lap, practicing the strategy of stillness I had learned in 1,000 boardrooms. Yet while I had spent years playing the delicate game of family, believing in the sanctity of our bond, my mother had been playing a game of total war. I closed my eyes and leaned back, the silence of the cabin wrapping around me like a shroud. I reflected on the fundamental American value of self-reliance that had always been my North Star. Independence isn't just about earning a 6-figure paycheck or having a title like vice president. It's about owning the right to your own mind, your own labor, and your own future. In that Greenwich dining room, I hadn't just signed away money. I had allowed Lavinia to trespass into the sanctuary of my identity. A childhood memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. I was 7, and I had a wooden clock I was trying to fix. I had spent days studying the gears. When I couldn't get it to tick right away, Lavinia simply picked it up and tossed it into the trash. "It's broken, Angela," she had said with that terrifyingly calm smile. "We don't keep broken things. We replace them." It was a lesson I had buried deep, but now it burned in my gut. To my mother, everything, including her youngest daughter, was a disposable asset, a piece of a puzzle to be moved or discarded to suit the bigger picture. I understood then that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing the scorpion to sting you twice. It doesn't mean keeping your heart open to those who want to hollow it out. It means walking away with your dignity intact, so the sting no longer defines who you are. I wasn't going back to beg for my life. I was going back to reclaim the architect. I opened my laptop. The glow of the screen reflected in my tired eyes, and the Wi-Fi had finally stabilized as we moved closer to the coast, and I established a secure, offline local sync with Caspian. My movements were methodical, my fingers moving with a cold, strategic brilliance. Lavinia and Kaylin believed they had won because they had the Aegis source code. They thought they had sold the crown jewels to Ravencorp for 15 million pieces of silver. What they didn't understand was that I had seen the rot in our family coming years ago. I had embedded a honeypot sequence deep within the version of the code stored on the family server, the one Lavinia had access to. By selling that specific version, Lavinia had unknowingly distributed a digital fingerprint across every financial institution involved in the transfer. It wasn't just code, and it was a tracking sequence that documented every hand the stolen money touched. Every dollar diverted to Kaylin's Manhattan penthouse. Every cent used to bribe the doctor for that fake psychiatric report was now being logged in a secure federal vault Caspian and I had established. She had handed the government a perfect, unbreakable chain of evidence for a federal money laundering case. I sat there in the dark, feeling a surge of empowered, cold satisfaction. I was no longer a victim waiting for the blow to land. I was the architect of my family's reckoning, using the very greed they used against me to bind them. In the world of high-stakes technology, the loudest person in the room is usually the most vulnerable. Kaylin was loud. Lavinia was loud in her manipulations. But the quietest person, the one who sits in the corner and observes, is usually the one holding the kill switch. I looked at the data cascading down my screen, a surgical map of their betrayal. This wasn't about revenge. It was about a final accounting. It was about ensuring that the cost of their choices was paid in full. I felt a profound inner peace settling over me, a clarity that only comes when you stop hoping for people to be who they are not. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, handing me a warm towel and a small plate of nuts. I looked up and thanked her with such genuine kindness that even I was surprised. She smiled back, a brief moment of human connection amidst the war zone high above. I told myself that pain should make us softer towards the world, not harder. If I let their cruelty turn me into a machine, they would have truly won. I had to uphold the qualities of a woman who valued kindness, compassion. Even as I prepared to destroy the lives of my own flesh and blood, I opened a blank document and drafted a final private message to my father, Ossian. My hand hovered over the keys. I wanted to give him one last chance to do the right thing, to step out of the shadows of Lavinia's ambition. I wrote, "Dad, the door is closing. Silence is a choice, and choices have consequences. Don't let her take your soul along with mine." I knew the odds of him responding were slim, but I had to know I tried. The most expensive thing in the world is the trust you realize you can never buy back. Once it's gone, no amount of success or real estate can fill that hollow space. As the plane finally crossed the threshold into U.S. airspace, the satellite connections surged. My screen lit up with a barrage of notifications, but one stood out, marked with a red urgency flag. It was from Caspian. He sent through an unencrypted emergency channel to ensure it bypassed my filters. My heart skipped a beat as I read the jagged lines of text. "Angela, abort the standard exit. They found out about our secret meeting with Thayer's firm. Lavinia is at the airport terminal now, but she's not alone. She brought a private medical transport team and 2 orderlies to seize you the moment you clear customs." I stared at the message, the blue light from the laptop making my skin look like marble. She didn't just want my money anymore. She wanted to erase my existence, lock me up in a treatment center where my illusions about the theft would never reach a judge. I looked out the window. Below, the lights of the American coast began to sparkle like thousands of tiny diamonds, a land of freedom being turned into a trap for me. And the next hour would decide whether I would continue to be the architect of my own life or become a prisoner in my mother's design. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the railing. I wasn't just suspended 30,000 feet above the ocean. I was suspended between the life I had lost and the battle I was about to fight on land. The transition from the silent sky to the chaotic terminal was jarring. Every footstep felt like a lead weight. I scanned the crowd, my pulse a rhythmic drum in my ears, searching for the ambush Caspian had warned me about. I had walked through these gates 100 times as a successful executive, but today I felt like a fugitive in my own city. The ambush was immediate and surgically precise. As I cleared the threshold of the gate, I saw her. Lavinia stood there, draped in a charcoal wool coat, and her face a masterpiece of practiced maternal agony. Behind her stood 4 men in sterile white uniforms, medical transport staff, their faces as blank as the marble floors. "Angela, thank God you're home!" Lavinia cried out, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of passing travelers. She rushed toward me, her eyes wet with fake tears. It's going to be all right, darling. We're going to get you the help you need. The stress of Tokyo. It's just been too much for your poor mind. I stood my ground, my posture rigid as I felt the violation of her touch. The white-coated orderlies moved in, forming a claustrophobic semicircle around us. I understood the stakes with terrifying clarity. If they forced me into that private ambulance, the 72-hour psychiatric hold would begin. Within that window, Lavinia would finalize the sale of the Aegis IP to Ravencorp, and my voice would be legally strangled by a diagnosis I didn't deserve. She had obtained a warrant for emergency involuntary commitment, leveraging the forged psychiatric records she'd tricked me into authorizing. She was using the mental health laws of the United States as a weapon of kidnapping. "Angela, please don't resist," she whispered, her voice dropping to a vicious hiss that only I could hear. "You're mistaken. You're hallucinating." I didn't scream. I didn't show her what she wanted to see. I looked at the officer on duty, a man with cold, professional eyes. I said, my voice sharp and razor sharp, "I demand to see the specific case number on that arrest warrant. I also demand that Port Police be present immediately." Lavinia's face briefly showed anger. The truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. It just needs to be held firm. The tension was a physical weight until a voice cut through the terminal noise like a gunshot. "That warrant is stayed." Thayer, my attorney, strode toward us, his briefcase swinging like a shield. Behind him, he trailed a uniformed officer. Thayer didn't waste time with pleasantries. He served Lavinia with a counter-injunction, his face a mask of legalistic ice. Caspian had provided the digital audit trail, proving I had been active, high-functioning, and leading multi-million-dollar negotiations in Tokyo. The claim of incapacity was a demonstrable lie. The medical team, sensing the shift in legal gravity, backed away. I was whisked through the airport and into the back of Thayer's black sedan. As we sped toward his Manhattan office, watching the rain-streaked glass of the city, the betrayal felt like a cold stone in my stomach. My own mother had tried to lock me in a cage of shadows just to protect a house built on my stolen labor. I looked at Thayer, my reflection in the window looking older, harder. "A home should be a foundation, not a prison," I said, the words heavy with the cost of my realization. "My mother forgot that you cannot build a dynasty on the ruins of your child's soul." At the firm, the lights were sterile and white, the atmosphere thick with the scent of old paper and fresh ink. Caspian was there, hunched over a laptop, his eyes bloodshot but triumphant. "The honeypot triggered, Angela," he said, showing me a cascading screen of red alerts. Ravencorp had discovered the security locks in the code. They were panicking. And they were already looking for someone to sue for fraud, and their lawyers were currently drafting notices for Lavinia and Kaylin. The software was a radioactive asset, and my family was holding the core. Thayer placed a final document on the desk, the Federal Freezing Order. By signing it, I would effectively paralyze every bank account, every asset, and every luxury purchase my family had made in the last month. It would bankrupt them. It would strip Kaylin of his penthouse and Lavinia of her prestige. I looked at the pen, then at a small, faded photograph of my grandfather tucked into my wallet. He had taught me that honor is a quiet thing, but it must be defended. I wasn't doing this to destroy them. I was doing this to save what we stood for. I signed the paper. The ink was like a seal stamped on the past. The buried resentment finally began to fade, replaced by a heavy, painful determination. I had tried to be the girl they wanted me to be, but now I was the one creating the truth they feared. As the last page was put away, my phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it and saw a picture of a massive mahogany door covered with banners that read, "Welcome Home." It was Kaylin's penthouse apartment. The caption was a final, arrogant, and sarcastic remark. "Don't bother coming here anymore. The lock has been changed. You're just a ghost now, Angela." I stared at the message, the blue light of the phone making my skin look like marble. The ink on the court filing was still wet, a silent promise that the ghost was about to haunt their golden feast. They had celebrated my erasure, but they hadn't realized I was the one who designed the world they were currently living in. I stood up, grabbing my coat. The time for hiding was over. The counter-strike had begun, and I was going to be there to see the moment their house of cards finally faced the wind. The elevator doors opened to a symphony of laughter and the clinking of glasses, a celebration of a theft I was never meant to survive. I stepped out into the foyer of the Manhattan penthouse, the air smelling of expensive lilies and wood smoke from the fireplace. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Oh, a million stolen lights mocking my presence. I didn't break down the door. I didn't need to. I simply entered the service code, the one Kaylin had forgotten to change, and walked in like a specter. For a moment, I just stood in the shadows, watching the people I shared blood with toast to my erasure. Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a while, but it ain't going away. Kaylin stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a group of investors, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a visionary. He was talking about the Aegis acquisition, describing the genius behind it as if it were his own reflection. I stepped into the soft yellow glow of the chandelier. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden, a physical weight that pressed the air out of the room. "Angela!" Lavinia gasped, her face pale as she clutched a silk shawl. I ignored her and walked straight to my brother. "Kaylin," I said, my voice steady as stone. "I'd like a glass of that vintage wine. It's the least I'm owed, considering my intellectual property paid for every drop in this room." The celebration died instantly. Lavinia, ever the actress, tried to bridge the gap with a whisper. She told the guests I was unwell, gesturing to her head with a look of mock pity. But I stood tall in my charcoal suit, my posture sharp and my eyes clear. I looked at Kaylin, a man built on stolen sand, and I felt a strange flicker of pity. He didn't know how to build. He only knew how to take. "You think you're the master of this house," I told him, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you're just a tenant in a lie." I realized then that I wasn't there for a fight. I was there for the final accounting. Just as Lavinia reached for the intercom to call security, the heavy mahogany doors swung open again. But it wasn't the building staff. Thayer entered, flanked by 4 men in dark suits, federal marshals. The atmosphere turned from festive to frozen in a heartbeat. Thayer didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a blue folder containing the ex parte emergency order. "This property is now a seized asset," he announced, his words cutting through the luxury like a gavel. "All bank accounts associated with the Miller Family Trust and the sale of Aegis are officially frozen. This includes all personal effects acquired through fraudulent proceeds." The music stopped. The catering staff froze mid-pour, and I watched as the "Welcome Home" banners were literally ripped from the walls by marshals to make room for evidence tags. Lavinia let out a strangled cry as a marshal requested she remove the diamond necklace around her neck. Property bought with the first installment of my stolen life. Cinematic chaos erupted. Guests began to flee toward the elevators, leaving their half-eaten caviar behind. Amidst the frantic movement, I saw a marshal roughly grab my father, Ossian, by the arm. I stepped forward, placing my hand on the marshal's sleeve. "We are here for the truth, not for cruelty," I said softly. "Let him sit down." My heart was intact, even if my mercy was exhausted. Kaylin had a complete breakdown, his face turning a blotchy red as he screamed that I was ruining the family. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice a whisper of steel. "I didn't ruin this family, Kaylin. I just stopped paying for the lies that kept it together." The anatomy of their collapse was breathtaking in its speed. Lavinia realized the honeypot I had embedded in the code had traced the sale money directly to an offshore account she thought was invisible. She wasn't just losing a house. She was becoming the primary suspect in a federal wire fraud investigation. The house of cards had finally faced the wind, and it was scattering. Thayer stood in the center of the living room, explaining the civil asset forfeiture process to my mother as if he were reading a weather report. He informed her she had 24 hours to vacate before the government changed the locks for good. Lavinia looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal, realizing that the prestige she had traded my soul for was vanishing in real time. The legal realism of the situation crushed her silence. I didn't feel the joy I expected. I only felt a heavy, hollow peace. I had reclaimed my name, but I had lost the family I thought I knew. In the midst of the marshals labeling furniture and boxing records, Ossian moved toward me. His face was ash gray, his hands trembling as he pulled me into the kitchen, away from Lavinia's piercing gaze. He looked over his shoulder, a man terrified of the woman he had married. "I have the tapes, Angela," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of evidence tape being pulled. "I recorded everything. The night she planned the medical hoax. The way she laughed about the Tokyo trip. Please, just tell the judge I was forced to watch. I couldn't stop her." I looked at my father, the man who had traded his conscience for a quiet life, and felt a cold wind blow through my spirit. He had been a witness to my erasure, a silent partner in my burial. "You were never forced to watch, Dad," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of 20 years of disappointment. "You just chose not to look." I realized that the recordings weren't a gift. They were a confession of his own cowardice. I stepped back from him, feeling the final tether to my childhood snap. The truth was finally out, but it was uglier than I ever imagined. I walked toward the balcony, gazing out at the city skyline. I was no longer the ghost haunting a lavish party. I was the only one in the room in control of myself. The ink on the court documents had dried, and the hammer's resounding blows shook the floor beneath my feet. I returned to the room, watching the police lead my brother away. The battle on the ground was far from over, but the penthouse of lies had been officially demolished. I sat in a quiet, upscale coffee shop near Central Park, the steam from my cup rising in a slow, rhythmic dance. The city outside was waking up, indifferent to the seismic shift that had occurred in my life only hours before. Ossian sat across from me, his shoulders slumped as if the very air had become too heavy to breathe. Without a word, he pushed a sleek silver drive across the table. It was the coward's confession, the digital recordings of Lavinia and Kaylin plotting my erasure while I was 10,000 miles away. I opened my laptop and pressed play. Lavinia's voice filled the small space between us, as sharp and devoid of the maternal warmth she wore like a costume. She described me as a useful tool, a resource to be managed so that Kaylin could have the life he deserved. Listening to her, I felt a strange, cooling stillness. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the heat of rage. I simply closed the laptop and looked at the man who had shared her bed for 40 years. The truth doesn't just set you free. It reintroduces you to yourself. I saw the daughter I used to be, and I saw the woman I had become, the one who no longer needed their permission to exist. "I forgive you, Dad," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a final judgment. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I can still trust you with my life. You chose silence while they tried to bury me, and now you have to live with that silence." He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. A broken man realizing that loyalty to a lie is the heaviest burden a soul can carry. I handed the drive to Thayer, who was waiting at a nearby table. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about ensuring the legal case was airtight. I had to protect the integrity of my work, and more importantly, the integrity of my future. The following days were a rhythmic, decisive blur of legal finality. The federal court moved with surgical precision, finalizing the liquidation of the Manhattan penthouse and the total reversal of the Aegis IP sale. Dean Lavinia and Kaylin were served with formal indictments for wire fraud and conspiracy, the paper trail I had created with the honeypot serving as an unbreakable net. I oversaw the process with the weary precision of a professional. I ensured a small, modest trust fund was established for my parents' basic needs. I didn't do it because they deserved it. I did it because mercy is about who the giver is, not who the receiver is. I met Lavinia one last time in Thayer's conference room, a thick pane of glass or perhaps just a sea of legal documents separating us. Even then, cornered and defeated, she tried to blame me. "You destroyed this family, Angela," she hissed, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. "You chose a machine over your own flesh and blood." I simply placed my hand on the table, my expression as calm as a frozen lake. I didn't feel the need to argue or defend my heart. "I didn't destroy us, Mother," I replied softly. "I just stopped pretending the rot wasn't there. You call this a betrayal. I call it a final accounting. The debt of our relationship is officially settled." The drive out of New York City was the most peaceful journey of my life. I watched the Manhattan skyline fade in the rearview mirror, the towering glass structures shrinking until they were nothing more than a memory. I was no longer the disposable daughter, or the smallest voice in a room of giants. I was the architect of my own destiny. I shared a final phone call with Caspian, thanking him for being the only soul who saw the person behind the code. We discussed a new venture, one built on honesty as a first principle, where transparency wasn't a feature, but the foundation. As the open highway stretched before me, leading toward the quiet coast, I addressed the lingering ghosts in my mind. For those of you who have ever felt erased by the people meant to protect you, know this: I didn't win because they lost. I won because I stopped needing them to love me, to know I was worth loving. Sometimes, you have to walk away from everything you thought was home, just to find where you truly belong. It's a terrifying leap, but the air is clearer on the other side. Have you ever had to walk away to find your own way home? I hope you find the courage to listen to that inner voice before the world tries to drown it out. I took my phone out of my pocket, intending to turn it off and enjoy the absolute stillness of the evening. But as the screen lit up one last time, a notification popped up from a law firm I didn't recognize, located in a small town in Maine. I hesitated, then tapped on the message. It read, "Ms. Angela Miller, regarding your grandfather's secret second estate in Maine. We have found the real ownership papers, and his last letter, written specifically for you. He knew this day would come." I stopped in a small seaside town just as the sun began to set below the horizon, painting the Atlantic Ocean with shimmering golden hues and deep indigo. I breathed in the salty air, feeling the tension of the last 2 decades finally dissipate. A door closing isn't the end. It's just the moment you finally hear your own heartbeat without the noise of other people's expectations. I felt a profound peace, a spiritual victory no bank account could ever match. But you've all faced the difficult choice between family peace and self-respect. What did you do when the people who should have been your rock turned into a storm? Share your story in the comments. I really want to hear how you found your way back to shore.